to have as an impromptu guest someone who's been with us longer than anyone else in the room. Klaus Krippendorf.
Well, it's impromptu. You see my PowerPoint. And I'm responding probably to many of the things that I've heard. And let me just say that I have been publishing and writing about cybernetics to make a discursive shift. And that shift actually started for me when I heard Margaret Mead in 1968 saying that Norbert Wiener's kind of cybernetics, which is mathematical, it just favors deterministic machines, etc., and favors all kinds of developments. And she, as an anthropologist, and that is important to realize, said, well, I came to these Macy Foundation meetings because it was so exciting to see so many disciplines working together and finding out something new. And then she defined cybernetics as a language that brings people together from different disciplines to to define and create problems and solutions that nobody can do by himself. And that to me is, I think, still a motivating factor. The other thing is, let me say, I was an Ashby student, and Ashby defined, now I'm rephrasing it, but Ashby defined cybernetics as an exploration of self-organizing systems, all possible self-organizing systems, and he made a kind of addition saying, and it is informed if some of them have not been found or can't be built or cannot be useful. So these two things, I think they come together. Now, second order cybernetics was a shift. Now here I'm becoming very critical. I don't know, several of you don't agree with that, but it became a shift from the observed to the observer. But the difference between observed and observer was still there, except that the emphasis was from objectivity to subjectivity, or the recognition that what we observe is constructed in our mind and we have to take responsibility for it. But it avoids actually the notion of language. Now, it is not, of course, you will immediately say, no, Maturana said all the time we live in language. True. We also, Ernst von Glasersfeld studied, in fact, how language affects cognition, all true, but then assuming language has a certain structure according to which the cognition is constructed, and that is kind of limiting. And Heinz von Förster added to the statement of Maturana, everything is said by an observer, saying everything is said to an observer, making clear that it is a relationship of communication, but between observers and not between actors. And I think that underlying is a theory of language that we are trapped in, that always talks about truth. And when yesterday we talked about, is it real? There's always this assumption there has to be something real, or there has to be something that we talk about. I'm not interested in this kind of language. And I'm starting, let's say, with Wittgenstein, who said language is a collection of language games, like asking questions, getting answers, etc., etc. So there are lots of language games, and he described it actually, and there is something that he has been criticized, rightly so, that a game is often related to a result, to a winning. And that is actually was not his intention, but he described it by how a master builder with an apprentice asked what he has to say in order to build a house. So there's always the element of communication, coordination towards some action, but not necessarily to win or lose. So I think let me start with my notion of conversation, and we have heard the one that Paul proposed, and that had to do with goal direction. I think conversation is far more basic. Conversation is a natural, often occurring phenomena when people have mutual respect and engage in an exchange. And what is most important is there is no goal, there is no direction that has to be followed. No conversation repeats what a previous conversation was making. The meaning of everything said is not related to the outside. The meaning of what is said is how one responds to. That means you see that there is no reality outside. It has something to do with how you respond or act. And that is a very different notion of conversation. Now, I'm relating it also to Martin Buber, who had a kind of a community theory of conversation in which innovation so stays within or emerges in conversation, and there's respect in the community, etc., etc. I don't want to get into that. But conversation, one could say, of the kind that I described is ideal and doesn't happen that often. But when it happens actually as a norm, when something goes wrong. When someone talks too long, well, you have to say it against some sort of a measure. It doesn't need to be quantified, but then you have a sense that that person talks too long. Or when you hear someone saying, well, I know more than you do, well, that ruins the conversation. Or when someone says here, well, the goal of this conversation is, that's what you're saying is irrelevant, that ruins the conversation. So, and I would say all conversations, or actually Martin Buber said at some point, we have always dialogical moments. I mean, moments at which we are respecting each other, where we see opportunities, etc., etc. Now, there's one important feature that relates to also what Paul was saying. I think conversation is the most efficient evolutionary process ever existing. Someone says something, someone else builds on it, or not. When it's not built on, it's forgotten, but with consensus. And what comes out of a conversation is actually opportunities that each presents to the other, and there comes out something that neither of them could predict. That is kind of the conversation. But I wanted to say it gets ruined by all kinds of things. For example, someone talking too long, or someone saying, I'm an authority on the subject matter, and you are not. And I represent someone who's not present. And I can tell you in faculty meetings is one of the most frustrating things when you have a faculty meeting and then there's the decision to be made and say, well, I have to talk to my department head. Well, then this person isn't really part of the conversation. Then outsiders enter and ruin, in some sense, the conversation. So, I mean, a conversation is, to me, a genuine conversation is a norm against which we measure what is happening. And the conversations erode into all kinds of formal communication, lectures, you name it. And that is not a conversation. What I'm doing is not a conversation because I'm talking more than you do. But the point is that there is an outer and often shift, and it's often with consensus of the participants that it goes differently. But what I'm really interested in is one step further, and that is discourse. Now, to me, if you go to the dictionary says discourse has something to do with writing, and I think that is too limited because it leaves out actually those people who write, the discourse community. To me, a discourse is a self-organizing system in which a community protects each other's, qualifies the members of the discourse community. For example, physicists, in order to become a physicist, you have to have a PhD or something like this, and then you are introduced in the discourse community of physics. Or if you want to be a biologist, you have to have that proper education, you know the vocabulary, etc., etc. Then you are accepted in the discourse community of biologists. But discourse communities are characterized by several things. One of which is that they create discourse-specific artifacts. They don't exist in reality, but they are discourse-specific. what are the discourse-specific artifacts of physics? Theories. And what are them in biology? Well, biological explanations. Or what about in sociology? Or what about in medicine? It is diseases that one can cure. So these are all discourse-specific artifacts. They don't exist outside there without the discourse having constructed them. Another important part of any discourse is to close the boundaries and protect their discourse from intrusion from others. As I mentioned already, entrance examination of members, but also when you write an article and I'm submitting that, and this is not communication, this is submitted somewhere else. And these are all control mechanisms that prevent the discourse from being eroded by others. Actually, I'm also interested, and I don't want to get too deep in that, how discourses interact with each other. Discourses can usurp other discourses. Psychology, for example, is now usurped by cognitive science. Increasingly made irrelevant because cognitive science has better models, supposedly, and intrudes into psychology, and these are different kinds of discourses, different artifacts that they are creating. But one of the most important part of a discourse is that it institutionalizes its recurring practices. What are recurrent practices? Practices that are routine, that are expected, and they're institutionalized in a sense that everyone needs to know them, everyone needs to follow them. There are textbooks written on that. For example, in experimental methodology in psychology, you buy a textbook, you know what an experiment is, you know how you have to control variance. This is institutionalized. And so I think all discourses institutionalize their practices in order to produce particular discourse-specific artifacts. Now, I think one thing that interests me, and I can go on there, or maybe I mentioned earlier, and it came to mind, about the artificiality of the discourse-specific topic, physics. And I had arguments with physicists, they're hopeless, and they say, no, we describe the universe the way it is. And that is the reality that we are concerned with. But think about the big collider between France and Switzerland. Millions of dollars were spent. Millions of people are working there. And what do they do? Well, they're looking for a particle, the God particle, and they found it. The God particle, or boson, is something that came out of discourse. It was an invention within the discourse of physics, and now they're trying to produce it in order to maintain their discourse. Now, as I said, physicists don't agree with that, but the point is actually that particle has only a fraction of a second existence, quote, on Earth. It cannot be found there. It's a true artifact. It's an artifact of physics. Without physics, it would not have existed. Just as a car, without a producer of a car, it would not have existed. So that's a very different kind of way of thinking about language, or what language does. And it is really, these are entirely discourse-specific type of artifacts. They come from discourse and go back. When we talked earlier about stages of realization, there's a good article a book by Woolgar, who said correctly, I think all scientific ideas come from discourse. Then you construct a reality where you can find it. Then you observe that reality and explain what you observe in terms of what you have constructed. And then you deny, and that's the basic part, deny that it comes from discourse, deny that you have constructed it, and to describe it as if it were real, and if you have correctly, in quote, described it. So, but this is discourse. But I think there's another element, and that goes in the issue of design and organizations. I mean, organizations too develop their own kind of culture, if you want, or terminology, and you can describe that very carefully. But they have also always recurrent practices. And recurrent practices are routine kind of things that you do automatically or have to do as part of the requirements. And there is a very interesting relationship between recurrent social practices and recursive functions. A recursive function is part of, if you want, computer science, mathematics, and as soon as you have recurrent practices, then you have a chance of converting them into an algorithm. And I'm saying that actually most discourses, most social organizations have a benefit of translating their recurrent practices into algorithms. Now, there are algorithms that simply help people, like an app in a telephone, make something more efficient. But there are also algorithms that replace people, like a teller, bank teller. And we had earlier the argument of whether the number of tellers have decreased or so, and I don't want to get into that because in my experience, they have decreased. And now we have teller machines, or the travel agent is replaced by automatic booking system. So that is a very different kind of thing. So we have support of everyday activities, like a cell phone. We have replacement of individuals, but then we have also the algorithmization of larger systems. Think about the electric grid. We don't know how it works, but it is there. And we don't know, in fact, I'm surprised that nobody really talked about those here, these kind of big systems that are behind us that determine how we behave and how we are affected, mainly because you don't see it. They become apparent when we talk about cybercrime, breakdown, like for example, when in New England the electrical system disappeared, in Germany the railroad suddenly this was disconnected, in Britain hospitals could no longer function for a while. So these are large systems that are implemented and determine how we behave. If you want, that is cyberification. Without cybernetics, they would not have existed. This is actually our product, not recognized as our responsibility. And I think that this is a big danger. And actually Margaret Mead said, and that was 50 years ago, she saw a very different reality, and there was not that much of computer systems, but she also observed that on the level of international relationships, we develop systems that nobody really understands, and that it will determine our relationship with other countries, and we need to understand that. So, and I'm asking myself, what can we do as cyberliticians? Well, I think, first of all, you have to realize all of these systems are self-organizing. Self-organizing in the sense that they determine their own structure once implemented. And once you have a self-organizing system that is installed, it's very difficult to get into it. They become immune to changes. It's very simple to think about big data not liking or something, but it is not so easy to realize that big data are part of a whole machinery to control the whole economy. If you think of Amazon and so on, I mean, that's things we still see, but we don't see really what is behind there. There are three propositions. One is when a system, a self-organization is instituted, installed, you can never, by observation alone, reconstruct the discursive origin. All of these systems have had discourses origins. That means computer programmers talked about what can we do, and they negotiated, etc., how it should be implemented. But once it's implemented, you cannot get it. You cannot get back to the discursive source. But one could demand transparency. That makes a lot of sense. But this is often not possible. Recently there was a case written up in the New York Times. A board for parole, some prisoner who was a model prisoner and had hardly any problems, and he was twice on a parole board, and then it turns out that the score was too high to release him. So now, the lawyer said, I'd like to see why. And the judge said, I would like to see the algorithm. Well, it was proprietary, so there was nothing to be done. It cannot be made visible. It cannot be criticized. So, in some sense, once something is implemented, and you know, some of you are probably computer programmers, where if you see someone else's computer program, even if you see the machine version, you cannot easily go to why it was done. I'm in another area, in content analysis, which I'm working. There are so many programs that say they can extract content and get to the meaning of things and so on. I'm always saying, oh, how do you do this? I can't tell you, but we guarantee content is extracted. It's all bogus, but this is the way it is. So that's the proposition one, is that we cannot possibly get access to it unless we make it somehow transparent. We could maybe interview the computer programmer. The second one is, because these systems are so overwhelming, so powerful, in quotes, search engines that go, to millions of documents in seconds, we attribute intelligence to it. Much of AI is precisely claiming that they are producing artificial intelligence which is superior to ours. And in some ways they do more than we can do as individuals. But that's not, in my opinion, intelligence. So I think one should challenge the habit of declaring these systems to be intelligent. What is missing, actually, very simple, is all these computer applications, algorithms, are totally context insensitive. They operate only on what is done. They cannot see the environment which is made. There is no intention. It's not intelligent in the human sense. But I think there is an unfortunate tendency for us to attribute intelligence to it. When you go, even when you go shopping, and then the cashier produces something that seems to be odd, well, then you get the answer, well, the computer says so. Well, that means you surrender, basically, to these machines. And I think there is a place for criticizing that. And so I think the whole notion of artificial intelligence is not intelligent, is, I think, intelligent support, perhaps. There are some people that say that artificial intelligence, then replacing machines for humans, is a big mistake. What one can do is supporting, helping out, yes, but not replacing. It's not intelligent. It's replacing only recurrent practices, those that are ordinary, that one can easily do. Now, but I deviated a little bit from the issue of design. I think all designers produce artifacts of recurrent practices. Whether this is applications in an iPhone, when you have to calculate something frequently, or whether this is a GPS, these are recurrent practices. They are routines. They can easily be mathematically described and then introduced into a machine. So the designers are always translating, in my opinion, discursive constructions of recurrent practices into machines and then let it go. But there's a third one, and that is attributing agency to it. Now, what is agency? Actually, the person that I'm particularly opposed is Latour, with the actor network theory, who basically ignores or rather confuses agency with causality. His good example is if you build a speed bump, that is a replacement for a policeman. Now there is, of course, from a city government point of view, it's cheaper to put a bump in there so that slows down cars, but you can't ask the speed bump for explanations, etc., etc. To me, agency is fundamentally related to being able to be accountable for the action taken. And machines cannot do that. So I think there is something very important to criticize. Now, I said earlier that all discourses draw their boundaries and institutionalize their practices, and so what about cybernetics? To me, cybernetics is also a discourse. But it is a discourse that is somewhat different. By default, perhaps, we have very few institutions. We have very few normative structures, but we can actually attack these kind of issues. For example, the issue of not being able to find out how a big system works. Well, we have a whole methodology developed, black box. We know how to handle black boxes by using alternative models and try to understand that, or re-engineering. That we have a lot of good terminology and good practices to tackle those kind of issues, and we ought to use them. So I think myself, I mean, I wrote a lot of notes here, but I think as a cybernetician, at least from my point of view, I would like to examine critically the kind of machineries, if you want, or cybernetic systems that cybernetics has created. I cannot take personal responsibility for that, but at least I can criticize that, I can analyze that, I can reveal to some extent to others how it works or what one should not do. For example, not to attribute agency to it. I think that is totally, it's dangerous because it surrenders actually one's own ability to act to someone that one cannot understand. So I think I will stop here. But I want to see cybernetics as, first of all, let me summarizing. First of all, seeing that it happens in discourse. It's not about things, it happens in discourse. And I wanted to mention, just because, I mean, everyone, Heinz Förster, Maturana, everyone says we describe systems, and we do constantly this issue of description. But there is another theory of language which has nothing to do with descriptions. For example, where language is seen as performative. When I make a promise, that is a linguistic act. I presume that you would confirm and maybe live up to it, and it becomes real, possibly, but it is not representational. When I apologize for something undone, badly done, that is also not a reality. That is an interaction which admits my agency, but also says that I was wrong. When I justify something, then I'm actually, at that moment, I'm creating the kind of choices that someone has made. In fact, we talked yesterday about having choices. Well, you can never have choices when you, I mean, I wouldn't say never, but you don't know what kind of choices anyone has. But if you ask someone, why did you do this? At that moment, you have to illuminate what kind of choices you had and maybe justify that you did the right thing or apologize for doing the wrong thing. At that moment, choices become apparent, interactively known. And another notion is a notion of understanding. It's very easy to say, oh, we want to mutually understand each other. Well, I have never seen anyone's brain to see whether it's the same like me. That is a bogus issue. Epistemologically, it cannot be done. Can we share the concept? No, absolutely not. But I think, again, speaking from the point of language, you can, in conversation, you can come to the point when someone says, I understand. That doesn't mean that there is an agreement. It means actually, I'm satisfied, let's go on. And that is a sign of going on, and it's not a sign of representation. So my whole argument is based on think about the language differently in interaction, in conversations, in terms of discourses, and the consequences of putting discourses into machines and putting them into our society and letting us govern by that, and we should be extremely careful about that. Thank you. If there are some objections, I would love to have them. Yeah.
Not an objection, but integration that we did on the future of marketing for the graduate students in Ontario School of Art and Design dealt with a number of those issues, and particularly the idea that consumers would be slotted into bands from which they could not escape, which would mean that they would have to buy these things, but they couldn't buy those things.
Yeah. Well, but see, that is also the result of algorithms.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go to a grocery store, it's not just that you buy cheese or whatever. You provide data, and then you get, actually from CVS, I'm just annoyed when I'm buying something, I'm getting a whole thing of all the things that I absolutely need, with $1 off and so. But this comes as a result of an algorithm that determines that people that buy this kind of things are most likely to eat that. Now that is not really bothering me that much. But what would be bothering to me when, for example, my credit card rating is changed, and I cannot do very much about this. So, and we have to realize that there is so much algorithms in reality built in, and I have to say, as a result of cybernetics, without cybernetics, there would not be any self-organizing systems of this nature. And when they are self-organizing, one cannot do very much from the outside. Actually, I was a little disappointed. There was on this list of about 65 issues, there was saying self-organizing is a misnomer. No? Well, is it a misnomer? Well, it depends. I think when self-organizing systems were invented, the concept in 1960, people didn't talk about social phenomena. They talked about physical things, and there I would even agree. They don't have a self, but there was one aspect that from the outside you couldn't influence them. Like a thermostat, it does its thing, except that you can set, of course, the temperature. But self-organizing systems in human terms means that there is a self within the system. They determine themselves as to how they want to be organized. And I think discourses are good examples, that discourses control how they see the world, what they're constructing, and relate to others in such a way that they preserve themselves. I have been in discussions with biologists and physicists, and it was very interesting to see when the biologists said here, talked about functions of organs and so on, and the physicists said, this is all bogus. Functions don't exist. Well, they don't exist, but there are useful constructs within biology. And I think when you want to understand an organism, then the notion of function is probably very critical. So these are constructions within a discourse that make a lot of sense within the discourse, but not across. Or another example, you go to a museum, University of Pennsylvania has a fantastic anthropological museum, and then you see artifacts. But you must realize there are now museums artifacts. There is a label then, where it comes from, when it was found, but it had nothing to do with the rituals where it was embedded originally. It's a totally different type of discourses. And I think we should realize that these discourses are often incompatible, or they are usurped, denied, etc., etc. Yeah.
Are you saying that these systems are literally self-organizing?
Yeah, literally, but to some extent. I mean, as I said, even discourses can be eroded, can be infringed upon. But for example, the legal discourse and the medical discourse, they have nothing to do with each other. The legal discourse determines who is a judge and a lawyer, and the medical discourse determines who can be a practitioner, but it's not no crossover.
So, like, Latour would do that on his modes of existence and stuff, in terms of like the different discourses. But to argue that they're literally self-organizing would be a discursive framework to say this might be a useful model. Other people might see these as sympoetic, and there's quite a lot of basic discussion. So,
but I would say they're literally self-organizing insofar as physicists determine who is a physicist, physicists determine what is a good physical theory, physicists determine what is the reality that we describe, the experiments we make, and that may not have any relevance in other discourses.
well, wouldn't you maybe be mystifying algorithmic ways of seeing things and doing things if you literally thought it was self-organizing? How are you going to demystify it, critique it, and draw stuff out of it if it's going to be opaque if it's literally only known to itself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you mean by literally, but let me give an example. Super fast trading on the stock market. That is an algorithm that responds in milliseconds to changes in prices and responds to buy or sell something instantaneously and make a lot of money. The first time they were used, actually, they ruined some very good companies overnight, and you couldn't do anything about it. But when you say literally, at that moment, it was not controllable. Later on, one could say, well, we should probably not install it. And at that moment, you're right that one can do something about it.
What if there was a power cut? What if there was a power cut?
Well, power cut, if it's an algorithm that does it, then you cannot do anything about it unless you know what the algorithm is that's behind that, or etc. You can shut off machinery, but very often we depend so much on them that we can't do that. And that's why I'm saying there is something very seductive, because we depend on that and so many things. We don't dare be challenging that. Well, the electric grid is a good example. I mean, I don't know how it works, but I know when there's a power failure and it's so spreading through a whole area, or when there is a cyber attack, you know, I mean, then you see the interconnectedness of the algorithms, and you can't do anything about it. You can disengage them, but often with considerable loss to communities, etc. Anyway, thank you.